Hi, this is John. Welcome back to my channel. A couple of weeks ago, maybe a week or so ago, I posted all of the books that I had read in 2022 because I forgot to do it at the end of 2022. And now, just like everyone else, I want to hop on that bandwagon and show everyone the books that I read in 2023. These were the books that I had completed by the end of the year. I've since completed about 3 or 4 more that I had almost finished and read most of in December, but these I had finished by December 31st. So, starting in January, this is what I read. Just again, really short reflections, 30 minutes or 30 seconds or so of commentary on each one. I have reviewed fewer of these than the ones in 2022 because I have a backlog of maybe 9 or 10 or 11 books that I haven't reviewed. So if you have any more questions about especially some that are maybe the last third of the list especially, you can ask in the comments. Otherwise, check the author, check the book title, and I may have dedicated a review to it already. The first book I read last year in 2023 was this, The Passions and the Interests, Political Arguments for Capitalism Before Its Triumph by Albert Hirschman. Hirschman was an economist. He wrote this in the 1970s, I believe, and he's a very interdisciplinary guy. He uses sociology, psychology, and philosophy along with economics to sort of cobble together an argument that capitalism is about not so much undirected greed, but actually directed and focused greed. You see a lot of arguments from medieval philosophers about how greed and concupiscence and other things, lust, are bad when they just have no direction and there's an excess of them. But he makes this argument that capitalism, as seen through the eyes of a lot of writers in the 17th century, first part of the 18th century, is a way to direct and focus desire. It's basically the heart of the thesis here. But short book, really fascinating, tightly argued, and kind of convincing. I don't really have the authority to judge the validity of the arguments or if they hold up, but it was well argued, I would say. Next was a book that I got from Princeton University Press, one of my favorite university press publishers, and this was Spin Doctors, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century by Sergei Gergiev and Daniel Treisman. And this looks at two concepts of dictatorship. What he calls, I forgot what he calls them, but there is a style of dictatorship that was popular through, say, the 1960s and 1970s, which is, man in military uniform using brutal violence and tactics to suppress a populace who is opposed to what he's doing. And then, once the 1970s and 80s come on, and there are international institutions on hand to oversee what other countries are doing, you start to see the changing face of dictatorship. And it starts to become more like a dictator 2.0, where dictators use more subtle means of manipulating the populace, like controlling media, for example. Instead of just throwing political prisoners in jail or murdering them outright, what they do is more behind the scenes. and it's an interesting. It's also very comparative, and it's very steeped in. Let me just show you some. Of course, when I want to find, I mean, there are graphs and charts in here too, so it's quantitative to a certain extent. But again, nicely argued, tightly argued, not repetitive, but with a lot of examples of what they're talking about from wide swaths of locations, not just European dictators or South American dictators or African dictators, but all over the world. This book was bad, and I explained why in my review of it. This is Lessons of History by Will and Ariel Durant, whose name you might know because they wrote that 11 or 12 volume set of History of Western Civilization series. These essays, I think, suffer in part from being, one, too short. This is a 100-page book that has 13 essays in it, with titles like History and the Earth. And History and the Earth is covered in 5 pages, pages 14 through 18. Can you cover anything meaningful about history and the Earth in 5 pages? I'd probably not. I know I couldn't, but because they're the Durants and because they wrote 5,000 pages of other stuff, they wrote this. This was written on the tail of them finishing their last volume, or maybe the second to last volume of that series, which was immensely popular. And I think they wanted to just maybe make, some quick money off of their name, which by then was widely recognized. But it being written when it was, despite the fact that it came out in the late 1960s, this is saying 1968, still wears a lot of weird prejudices on its sleeve. Prejudices I thought would have started to disappear by 1968, but I believe Will and Ariel Durant were both born in the 19th century, which might explain to some extent why they say some of the things that they do. But I go into that in my review, which is on Goodreads, or you can find it here on my channel too. I know Hannah over from Hannah's Books did sort of like an immersive thing with Willa Cather last year, but before she ever did that, I read this, and now I wish I would have read more to talk about this stuff with Hannah. This is A Lost Lady by Willa Cather, which I think is one of the books she read with someone else. I enjoyed this to a large extent. I think I gave it 4 out of 5 stars for whatever that might mean to you. But it makes me more eager to read books like O Pioneers and My Antonia and Song of a Lark and A Death Comes for the Archbishop and other things like that. Probably one of her more minor novels in the grand scheme of things. I might get some slack for this, and this is not a book that I have posted a review of because I don't really know what to say. I just need to start writing and see what comes out. I read this last year in 2023 for Historathon for the first quarter, Cleopatra, A Life by Stacy Schiff. Everyone and their mother has read this book, and I wasn't a big fan. I think I might be the only person I know who wasn't effusively in praise of it. I will have to flesh out why. I think one of the big reasons why is that most, maybe all of the primary sources we have about Cleopatra are men who were writing in a time when it was very easy to be highly misogynistic and dismissive of powerful women. And you get a lot of primary sources about Cleopatra who basically call her a whore. They may not use that word, but they're basically talking around that word. That yes, she was the Pharaoh of Egypt, but she used her feminine wiles and her beauty to manipulate people like Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. And that's just bullshit as far as I'm concerned. I think it's condescending, it's misogynistic, it's ridiculous, it's juvenile, and again, it sort of puts all of the onus on the popular historian who can see through attitudes like that to reconstruct what might have actually been the case. But going back to do that through the eyes of people whose takes were so skewed is really hard to do when that's all you have. That, in a nutshell, would be my critique of the book. Also, the fact that I think a lot of people who want to read about Cleopatra want to read maybe a long Wikipedia article and not necessarily a 300-page book about her. This goes into a lot of detail about things that happened before she met the people in the life who make her more famous, namely Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. But nevertheless, like I said, she was a pharaoh, so she is important in her own right. Gave birth to children by both Mark Antony and Julius Caesar too. But I think she just needs to be reconsidered in the light of people who didn't think so little of her. And there's a good attempt here, but it just didn't quite do it for me. And I would be interested in talking to other people. Unfortunately, it's been a year since I've read it, and I'm not really interested in going back to reread it. But if you were less than effusively praising of this, let me know what you thought and why you thought it. I also read Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnhem, a cute little book about a group of 4 English women who come up with this crazy idea to take a vacation to Italy. Women from 4 different backgrounds, 4 different ages, 4 different places in life. And they find themselves all in this castle that they have rented for the month of April in Italy. And they end up melding together and forming these kinds of unexpected relationships that are charming and delightful to read about. Again, another nice discovery by NYRB. Sometimes they curate titles that aren't exactly to my liking, and sometimes they really hit the nail on the head, like with this one and Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner, and a handful of others I've read recently. This I also reviewed and thought it was okay. This is A History of the Dark Side of Reason, Irrationality, A History of the Dark Side of Reason by Justin E.H. Smith, by Princeton University. This is a book that explores the idea of irrationality from different angles, from dreams, from the way we think about irrationality and logic, logical fallacies, things like that. And it seems a little cobbled together for my taste. There was no real through line, other than the fact that we like to think that we are eminently reasonable and rational, And under inspection, sometimes it turns out that we're anything but, which is something I kind of already knew. But something else I read for Historathon for Q2. This is Christine de Pizan's The Book of the City of Ladies, and this is an allegory, a book-length allegory, in which Pizan sings the virtues and the good deeds of women throughout history, and women throughout non-history too, being women in mythology, many women in the Bible that we don't have historical or archaeological evidence for, women in Greek and Roman myth, but many of them are historical too. It is a little listy, but nevertheless a really, really interesting piece of work. Kind of the definition of proto-feminism. This is from the beginning of the 15th century, if I'm not mistaken, around 1405, 1410, where she makes the argument that women are every bit as good as men, just as deserving as education, just as deserving of education. Sort of groundbreaking arguments 600 years ago. I also read Raymond Carver's collection of short stories called Cathedral. Most of these 12 stories, there are 12 here, didn't move me much, but 2 did. The 2 that I enjoyed were the last story, which is the title story, Cathedral, and there is another one called A Small Good Thing. One of these days I'll go back and hopefully reread the others. But if you ever get a chance, go back and read A Cathedral and A Small Good Thing. They are incredible stories. This is another book I read for Historathon 2023 and have not reviewed yet, on the medieval origins of the modern state, by Joseph R. Strayer. This looks at the ways in which institutions that come into the modern age, even into the early 21st century, had their origins in medieval practice and the birth of medieval government bureaucracy. I also read Barbara Kingsolver's The Poisonwood Bible. I enjoyed this. I thought it was good, strong even, but I also thought it was preachy. And while I agree with a lot of her preaching, novels that are preachy lose their power, even if you agree with them, and maybe especially if you agree with them. But this is a story that probably a lot of people watching this have already read, about a family from Georgia, the American South, Georgia or Alabama, that goes to Africa, what is Belgian Congo at the time, in the late 1950s, right before the revolution there. And what happens to them as they grow increasingly disillusioned about their status as Christian missionaries, and what happens to them in the wake of their overthrowing of the British government and the election of Patrice Lumumba. I also read the Stover Thrift edition of H.G. Wells's The Island of Dr. Moro, which I really enjoyed. Had never read H.G. Wells before, but liked this quite a bit. Oh, and this was a novel that was absolutely horrible. Um, and the funny thing is, this novel had a literary heyday when it came out in the 1890s. I want to say. I forgot when it first came out. In or around the 1890s. Um, 1894. It is so bad. It is so overwritten and so purple in its prose. The characters don't make sense. Some of them are overtly anti-Semitic. By the way, this is where the character Svengali comes from. He is a character in this book. Svengali being sort of the archetypical cosmopolitan, learned, uh, uh, sort of a Mephistophelian character that you can follow and come under the sway and influence of, but at a cost. And of course, he's Jewish, right? So, consorting with Jews is sort of like selling your soul to the devil or something. I don't really know what the message was there, but it's just a very weird book, poorly written. And it also has long stretches in French that the characters engage in that goes completely untranslated in this version. Now, that might be corrected in other versions of the book, but this Wordsworth classic leaves them untranslated, and I don't read French, so I would appreciate seeing what, you know, those half-page and page-long conversations were actually trying to say. This is a book I read with Vin from Revenant Reads and Stephanie Cohen. This is First Principles. Didn't we love this one? First Principles, What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country by Thomas E. Ricks. This was a book that could have been really promising, could have been really good, but just fell very, very short of the subtitle. It talks about Greeks. It's more about how classics influenced people, some of the founding fathers, but it's very poorly done. I wrote a review of it. If you're in the Discord, I think we also talked about in the Discord a bit between Vin, Stephanie, and I. It's not great. This is Inhumed Shadow, A Tragic History of German Ethnology by H. Glenn Penny. This was a book I was also kind of critical of. I read this for quarter 3 of Historiathon, and this is a book that looks at how the various collectors that were trying to build ethnographical collections in Germany at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century did that. And the problems that bumps up against when it comes to acquisitiveness, colonialism, the problems that museology, the building of museums, the nature of collecting and collating art objects has with those other topics. Again, see the review for more details. I also read The Ponder Heart by Eudora Welty. Not one of her best known books, but makes me want to go back and read some of the better known short stories. This is Brand Luther. I read this for Q3 of Historathon, how an unheralded monk turned his small town into a center of publishing, made himself the most famous man in Europe, and started the Protestant Reformation, by Andrew Pettigrew. This is in ways, kind of a biography of Luther, but it is a biography in a certain angle, in a certain mode, and that is, as the subtitle hints at, his relationship with the publishing world of early 16th century Europe, the surrounding towns in Germany, but as well as, as far down south as Venice, where Aldo Mantius was, working, what probably the most famous publisher in all of Italy down there in the early 16th century. But he carved out quite a place for himself, working in the industry. He was extremely, extremely popular, and ended up selling a lot of theological tracts that became more in demand over time because of, well, a variety of things, not just the fact that people were fed up with what they perceived to be an increasingly corrupt Catholic Church, but also because of the way that his tracts and his books were printed. He made sure to care about what they looked like on the page, so much that he actually got rid of one very relatively well-known bookmaker when he made books that didn't really impress him. And one of the ways that, oh goodness, who am I looking for here? It's not, oh goodness. It's an artist. Is it Krennic? There is one artist in here that basically became relatively well known in part because it is Lucas Krennic. Became relatively well known in part because of the illustrations that he did in some of Luther's books. So I didn't know about that relationship, and it goes into it a bit in here. This is one of the last books that, one of the first books that I didn't review. I think the last 5 of these are unreviewed as of yet, but hopefully I'll finish that in the relatively short term. This is Revolutionizing the Sciences, European Knowledge in Transitions, 1500 to 1700. And this just looks at where science was, where the scientific method, such as it was in 1500, which is not much of one, and how that changed over the next 2 centuries, where you end up in the year 1700 with a very, very well-established scientific method, after you've had people like Newton, Francis Bacon, and all of the other people that are discussed in here. But around 500, what you have is more or less where science has been for 300 or 400 or 500 years. It is basically Aristotelian investigation of nature. But over the next 200 years leading up to 700, you learn how mathematics, which was originally seen as a completely distinct and separate endeavor, was kind of hitched on to the study of the natural sciences and used to illuminate them and create laws that describe natural phenomenon. And that is, of course, one of the big leaps forward in the scientific revolution. you don't really know anything about Newton unless you know about the universal law of gravitation, right? Or and that is a law. It is a mathematically describable law. It's not just qualitative in nature. It is an equation. So it kind of traces those developments. Very, very Fred from Read by Fred read this, and I think he thought it was a little dense and scholarly, and it is. It is. It is short, but very, very tightly argued. He's very doesn't waste a lot of words, and the concepts are, you know, it might be good for like, you know, a university textbook or something. Maybe history of science, early modern science, but it was I enjoyed it. Something else that needs to be reviewed, A Thousand Acres by Jane Smiley. Very much enjoyed it. Weird book with a character plot twist I didn't see coming that I won't spoil here and may or may not spoil in a review. But it is a retelling, by the way, of the King Lear story from Shakespeare, but transmuted onto an Iowa farm of the 1970s with a farmer who has predictably 3 daughters whose names start with the first letters of Lear's daughters and their relationship with their increasingly senescent and senile father. Very, very good, interesting. My first Jane Smiley novel, and traumatic to read in some parts, but I enjoyed it. 3 more books. Sorry for the long video. I read this in conjunction with Brand Luther. This is more like a dual biography. Erasmus Luther, Fatal Discord, by the way. Fatal Discord. Erasmus Luther and the Fight for the Western Mind by Michael Massing. Michael Massing is a journalist, and usually when journalists write about history, you can get sort of varied levels of success with the end product. I have to say, this was a spectacular book. And if I read enough books in any given year to do a top 5 list or a top 10 list, I certainly don't. I think I read 23 or 25 books this year. That's not enough to do a top 5 list. That would be silly. I would be telling you about 20% of the books I read. This was one of the best books, one of the 2 or 3 best that I read last year. And it is told in alternating chapters about episodes in the lives of Luther and Erasmus in a chronological order. So 1 episode about Luther, 1 about Erasmus, 1 about Luther. And it's long. It's, 800 readable pages or so, 820. But so compellingly written. And not written for any kind of specialist, but if you're looking for a book that sort of details the very, very 2 different kinds of humanism that, if I don't know if you want to call Luther a humanist, but the 2 kinds of thought that Erasmian humanism and Lutheranism embody and how they bump up against one another. This is a superb place to start. It might be the best place to go, actually, because it answers a lot of questions and gives plenty of historical context, geographical context, A really, really great book. This is The Fire is Upon Us. James Baldwin, William F. Buckley, and the Debate Over Race in America by William Bucola, also from Princeton University Press. This is about the lead up to a famous debate they had on February 18th, 1965 in the Cambridge Union about the status of Black Americans in the United States, the question of race in America, with maybe one of the most eloquent writers in the 20th century, James Baldwin, being on one side, and then William Buckley, the famous blowhard and pompous nitwit, on the other. There's more to William Buckley than that, but he doesn't come across especially well in this book. And Bucola is relatively fair to him, as far as I can tell. But in the review, when I write one, I'll try to explain why we still read James Baldwin, and most of us probably don't read William F. Buckley anymore. And last but not least, The Rape of Nan King by Iris Chang. One of the more traumatic reads of 2023. I read this for quarter 4 of Historathon with Debs from Rainer Reed's Stuff. A great buddy reader, by the way. Just so insightful, with so much, history and knowledge that she gladly shared with me in Voxer. Thanks, Debs, if you're watching this. I really appreciate it. There's so much. This was about a relatively short period of time in late 1937 and very early 1938, when the Imperial Japanese Army invaded Nanking and killed on the order of something like 300,000 or 400,000 people in a matter of 4 or 5 or 6 weeks. And there are pictures in this book which may not be suitable for not even children, but maybe not even adults, like violent, graphic pictures. So just kind of quickly flip through here. Also, a lot of the textual descriptions of what went on is brutal. But she wraps everything up at the end with, I think, something that is called for by a lot of the things that happen in the 20th century, including what happens just half a dozen years later during World War II, the extermination of much of Europe's Jewish population, the extermination of many, many Ukrainian kulaks during the Holodomor. The question of history, complicity, responsibility, how we wash our hands of it, and how we take responsibility for it. I would have gladly read a book 3 times this long, even though the subject was so brutal to read about. So the word that kept coming up with in our conversation that I had with Debs was harrowing. This book is a harrowing book. I'm so glad I read it. It needs to be more talked about, but it is a harrowing book. That is the last book I finished in 2023. And I will be back soon with more reviews that I need to catch up on and post, and I will eventually be doing that. I have some other stuff coming up. So look for that. Maybe some Friday reads every once in a while. Until then, I will see you soon, and take care.